guys realize it, but today marks the end of our third year here and the beginning of our fourth year. So I guess this is as good of a time as any to apologize for having to put up with us for the last 3 years. Except for you guys. You guys have skipped out for 2 of those years. So they keep on telling us that we lose an hour in the spring and we regain that in the fall. I don't think that's true. I think just every year they steal an hour of our sleep, and that's just how things go. But this morning we want to look at Revelation chapter 2 and chapter 3. We want to talk about the importance of numbers, and numbers specifically of the size of a congregation. That is a huge topic of pretty much any time you go anywhere and you talk to other Christians. Where do you attend? How large is the congregation? How long has it been there? I know we get the question often, when we come here, how long have we been in existence? When are we going to get a real building? Those kind of questions come up a lot. Those are barometrics that are often used. And if you guys haven't realized, metrics that are used in Revelation chapter 2 and chapter 3. There are 7 churches here in Asia that are mentioned, and each of them, Jesus has something rather specific to say. In Ephesus, the main problem is they don't have enough people. And if you read there closely, you'll realize that that is the main problem, is that they just simply don't have enough people. When you get down into verse 8, and he talks to the church in Smyrna, well, they have too many who only come for services. They have a great number of people, but everyone skips out on Bible class beforehand, and they only show up for Sunday morning, and that's a problem. By the time you get to Pergamum, in verse 2, the main problem is that they just have too few on Wednesdays. They have a great number on Sundays. People attend Sunday morning worship, but their numbers drop drastically on Wednesdays, and that's the main problem with Pergamum. As you get to Thyatira, this is one of the mega churches. They have too many people. It's just far too large. That you can walk in there amongst 300 or 400 people and you get lost in the group, and everyone just feels really uncomfortable. And so the problem is they're too big. By the time you get to Sardis, this is the one where he just says that they're the right size. They are the Goldilocks of all the congregations. They're not too large, they're not too small. They're just perfect, and they need to stay exactly as they are. As you get to Philadelphia, you realize here that they're the right numbers, but for all the wrong reasons. That people attend for their social aspects, they attend for the basketball programs, and so while they're the right size, it's the wrong people in the door. And Laodicea, they just had problems all across the board because they both have not enough people and too many. It is a weird combination for 2. And of course, hopefully, numbers aren't talked about at all in Revelation chapter 2 and 3. Of all 7 churches, numbers are not mentioned once. I want us to think about that for a few moments. What I'd like to do is I want to go back through chapter 2 and chapter 3 and look at what is mentioned. If numbers aren't the main topic, then what is? So we're just going to go and we're going to kind of peruse through chapter 2, chapter 3. For those who have been in our Bible underlining classes, we're going to have our next one the first week of December, hopefully. And I went ahead and just marked up Revelation chapter 2 and chapter 3 in a very specific manner so I can follow through with myself easily. But in verse 2, he usually uses a phrase through most of these of I know. And specifically, I know your works in verse 2. And so he gives the positive first. I know your works, I know your toil and your patient endurance, and how you cannot bear with those who are evil, and have tested those who call themselves apostles and are not, and found them to be false. I know your endurance and your patience, and bearing up for my name's sake, and you have not grown weary. That's the positive. That's what's great about Ephesus. It doesn't mention how large they are. And we are left completely in the dark, whether they are a group of 15 or a group of 1,500, or any number outside of that range. What's mentioned is that they toil and they work and they have patient endurance and they can't bear with false teaching. That's what's great about them. He then mentions the negative in verse 4. But I have this against you, that you have abandoned your first love. Think back to what is the greatest commandment? The first and greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God by your heart, by your soul, and all your mind. And so while they work and they're willing to bear through the problems and they're not willing to put up with any false teaching, they're now going through the motions and they've lost that first love. And the first love isn't indicated by the size of the group. It's all indicated by their heart. And so the problem with Ephesus is that their heart's not in it. That's the key problem. And so as you go over to Smyrna, over in verse 8, and specifically in verse 9, he then picks up that phrase again. I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich. And the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but they are a synagogue of Satan. Smyrna is actually one of the few that he doesn't have anything negative to say. In fact, what he does, though, is give them an encouragement in verse 10, where he tells them, do not fear those who fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation, but be faithful unto death. Again, how large is the congregation of Smyrna? I have no idea. He doesn't mention them in a positive or negative way of having too many or too few. What is mentioned is that they have tribulations and they have physical poverty, but they have spiritual riches. And that they're willing to put up with slander, and they're not willing to handle, they're willing to handle those who speak falsely. And what he tells them to do is just remain faithful unto death. Persevere, to stay the course. And again, numbers just aren't mentioned. As you get to Pergamum, down in verse 12, and verse 13 specifically, he then gets into that phrase again, I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is, and yet you hold fast to my name, and you did not deny my faith, even the days of Antipas, my faithful witness, those who were killed among you, where Satan dwells. There were some problems that happened at Pergamum where some people came in and killed Christians. He tells them that where they dwell is a terrible place. You are where Satan dwells. You are in Satan's throne. I don't know how bad Pergamum was, but it sounds like a really bad place to live. It'd be the wrong side of the tracks to have your church building. It'd be the wrong place where you would want to drive at night with your cars unlocked. And yet he tells them that's where you worship. And I know where you dwell, and I know that you have remained faithful, and you haven't denied my name. And that's a great thing about it. But he has a negative. He's verse 14, but I have a few things against you. That you have some there who hold the teachings of Balaam, who have taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel, so they may eat foods sacrificed to idols, and to practice sexual immorality. And you have some who hold to the teachings of the Nicolaitans. And so while they're in this bad neighborhood, and while they are remaining faithful without denying Jesus, there are some who are going around and preaching false teaching, who are subverting whole households, as Paul tells Timothy. And they seem to be putting up with it. And so verse 16 rather, he tells them, repent. And if not, I will come to you soon, and I will war against you. But notice again, in Pergamum, they're not too large, they're not too small, they're not the right number. It is how faithful they are. And what they do with false teaching, that is the main point. As you go on to Thyatira in verse 18, in verse 19 he says, again, I know your works, your love and your faith and your service and your patient endurance, that you have later works that exceed the first. So the thing that was what was wrong with Ephesus back in chapter 2, the beginning of chapter 2, was they lost their first love. Thyatira, he says, I know of your love and your faith and your service and your patient endurance. And that's great about them. But whenever they opened themselves up to love so much, they had let in too much falseness. So in verse 20, he says, but I have this against you, that you have tolerated the woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, and is teaching and seducing my servants to practice sexual morality, to eat food sacrificed to idols. It's important. Now, sometimes we believe that showing love and patience and endurance is the same as being tolerant. And here Jesus parses out those two things in verse 19 and in verse 20, that you have shown love, and you have endured, and you have shown patience, but you have crossed the line in verse 20, and you have then tolerated evil among you. That was the same thing the Corinthians were proud of back in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Here's this man who has his father's wife, and we're proud that we can endure this, that we have patience with this person. And that's just not to be. And so here is this woman who is claiming to be a prophetess, which she isn't, and she is seducing people sexually, and seducing them to eat food sacrificed, as it were, to really idols. And he tells them in verse 21 that I have given her time to repent, but she refuses to repent. And behold, I will throw her into her sickbed, and those who commit adultery with her I will throw into great tribulation, unless they repent of their works. What was great and what was wrong with them had nothing to do with numbers. It was about their faithfulness and their tolerance of evil. As you get into Sardis in chapter 3, he again in verse 1 tells him, I know of your works, that you have a reputation of being alive, but you're dead. But the great thing among them is he mentions there in verse 4 that you have some who have not soiled your garments, and they walk with me in white, for they are worthy. That's what's great. There's some of them. But what's bad about them in verse 1 is that they're dead. Even though all the other congregations around them believe them to be a healthy, a sound congregation, someone who holds the truth, someone who does not build all the playhouses, and they don't support all the orphanage homes. They're a great, great congregation. And it may be, this is just complete and pure speculation. What if they were one of the largest in areas? And that's why people looked at them and said, they're doing well because they have 20 extra people to lead. What if that was the case? I don't know if it is. I have no idea if it is. But whatever it was that people looked at, and they used their barometers to say, well, they're a good congregation. They have a reputation of being alive. But Jesus writes to them and tells them that you are dead. And so in verse 3 tells them to repent then from what you have received and heard, or remember what you have received and heard, keep it and repent, for if you do not wake up, I will come like a thief, and you will not know the hour that I will come against you. And so what's great among them is that even though here is this congregation that is dead inside, there are some who have not soiled their garments, there are some who still walk with God. And then we get into Philadelphia there in verse 7. And again in verse 8, he tells them, I know your works. And what's great about them is, behold, I have set before you an open door that no one will be able to shut. I know that you have but a little power, and yet you have kept my word, and you have not denied my name. And when it comes to the negative things, it's just not applicable. There's nothing negative that he says about that congregation. But when it comes to the church in Laodicea, down in verse 14, he writes to the church of Laodicea. In verse 18, he again says, or verse 15 rather, he says again, I know your works. But he has nothing positive to say about them. If you read through verses 15 down to the end of the chapter, there's nothing that is good about them. They haven't produced anything that he can point out and say, well, this is what's great about you. What he says is that you're neither hot nor cold. And I wish that you were hot or cold. But as it is, you are lukewarm and neither hot or cold, and so I will spew you out of my mouth. They have no zeal. They're indifferent. There's no passion. Seems to be a congregation where people come in and they come out. Or they come and they maybe greet one another, but then they leave all their religion there. There's no passion. There's no zeal. There's nothing invigorating about their worship. There's nothing invigorating about their personal spiritual life. They're just there. That's all that they are. And so he tells them in verse 19, those whom I love I reprove and I discipline, so be zealous and repent. Now all of this, looking at all these 7 congregations, we realize that numbers weren't that big. But there's some other stories that numbers are also very important. A couple pages back in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 20, Peter mentions that Noah was a preacher of righteousness and that he saved himself and 7 others in an ark. And God was furious at him that he only saved 7 other people. It doesn't say that at all. In fact, there's never a mention that God is unhappy that his numbers were not enough or too many. It's a statement of fact that he was able to save 7 others, and God does not mention being pleased or displeased with that at all. The same thing as you get over to Gideon's army in Judges chapter 7. Numbers are important there. But God tells them, what you have is too many for me to give this enemy into your hand. It has nothing to do with them being too many. It has all to do with them realizing it is God who gave them the victory. So the question comes up for us. Here at Colonial, how many times can you think of the New Testament mentioning the size of a congregation? We know that 3,000 are still saved in Acts chapter 2. We know that they increase the number up to about 5,000 as you get a couple chapters over. And I can't think of another time the numbers are mentioned. Not in Asia Minor or Macedonia, not over into Corinth or in Jerusalem or Judea or Antioch. I can't think of a single time where the size of a congregation is ever mentioned. I think that's really telling about what isn't said. What if we're large, but we don't keep to God's standards? Does being large give us any benefits? What if we're small and we don't keep to God's standards? Does us being small give us any benefits in that scenario? What if we're large and we do keep God's standards? That's great. What if we're small and keep God's standards? That is also great. We view congregations almost solely on the amount of people that they have. If they're large, they're doing great. If they're small, they're not doing great. And if they're too big, we're not sure if they're okay, because that may be an indication that they're doing stuff that's wrong. We have all kinds of prejudgment based solely on numbers, and yet as you read through the New Testament and the standards of our congregation, numbers just simply aren't mentioned. So if we're going to talk about the importance of numbers, I don't even know where to turn to. I don't know a passage to turn to start talking about the importance of numbers. And I know we probably all have our own individual feelings when it comes to what size of a congregation we're comfortable with. I grew up in a small congregation. I've worked almost solely in small congregations. Does that mean anything? Maybe not. Maybe you come from a very large congregation and you feel uncomfortable in small congregations. So I'm sorry. Does that mean anything? Probably not. In fact, we don't see that when Jesus goes and talks to the 7 churches of Asia. That isn't important. It's just not there. And for us to put so much emphasis in our own minds and in our communication and our judgments of a congregation, it seems completely disconnected with what is the main emphasis in the New Testament. The main focus is not numbers, but their faithfulness. If we go back over to Revelation chapter 2, the main focus in chapter 2 for Ephesus is whether or not they abandoned their first love. And that could happen if they were a large congregation or a small congregation. That can happen to us, whether we grow large or we remain a smaller group. Losing or maintaining that first love has nothing to do with size and has everything to do with our hearts. When it gets into Smyrna, the great thing about them, he only mentions positive for them, that they have dealt with their tribulation and their physical poverty and the slander of those around them. And that could happen if they're a large group or a small group. It doesn't matter. What it matters is that they remained faithful. The same thing with Pergamum, is that they are in a terrible neighborhood, so to speak. But what happened is that they let in false teaching. They allowed God's standard to be relaxed so that other people could teach false things. And that could happen in large groups or in small groups. The same thing with Thyatira, is that they have become so loving that they believe that loving is also being tolerant of evil. And that can happen anywhere. And the same thing with Sardis, a congregation that can have a reputation of being alive but yet being dead on the inside. That can happen anywhere. That can happen to us here. That can happen in Philadelphia. But he mentions here in Philadelphia that they have remained faithful. They haven't denied his name, that they have held fast to what they have, and so that they will seize their crown. That's what we're shooting for. And the church in Laodicea, while they kept the doors open, and people seemed to be faithful in their attendance, so to speak, they were neither hot nor cold. There was no zeal. And so that was the main point, is what kind of zeal do we have? What kind of faithfulness do we have? How do we handle with false teaching? How do we handle with those who are wanting to practice unrighteousness? how do we handle those things? Because if we do great, then that's great, regardless of size. But if we don't, that's terrible, regardless of size. And so he tells them of coming and waging war against them. It's not because they're small. And he tells about removing their lampstand. Has nothing to do with them being too large. It has all to do whether or not they are willing to repent. So the question comes up for us is, how faithful are we? We use all kinds of barometers and barometrics to say, well, we're doing well because we have X amount of number of people who come on Sundays. And I know this topic comes up amongst preachers a lot, amongst elders, is that we have X amount of people who show up for Sunday morning class, and then so much more for a worship service, and the number drops down on Wednesdays, and we just can't keep the numbers right. And the conversation has turned the last decade or so about if the numbers are high on Sunday morning and they're low on Sunday night, then we just need to cut out Sunday night worship service because that's causing people to stumble. Those topics come up all the time. And those topics are used as a judgment on how we're doing. But that isn't mentioned at all in the New Testament. So the question for us is not necessarily how great are we doing numerically. Because we could work and we can work and we can work, and if God doesn't grant us reward for those things, if he doesn't open a door for the word, if he doesn't choose to produce here, then we're going to stay small. But we can remain faithful regardless. And if we work and we work and we work, and God blesses and abounds, and we grow large, but we become unfaithful in the process, it doesn't benefit us either. So the question has to start with us personally. How are we personally faithful? Because even if we happen to be in Sardis, where the whole congregation is dead, there can be some who remain faithful, who still walk with God, who still keep their robes pure. That can't be the case. That's absolutely can't be the case. But it begins with us personally. And then not only personally, but how do I interact with others? Because that's what happened at Thyatira, is that they have a love and they have a passion and they have faith and they have service towards one another. But their interaction when it comes to ungodliness was out of skew. They focus on themselves, and I'll live my life and you live your life. But that isn't how we are supposed to work as a congregation. And sometimes we can be like Ephesus, where we personally, we toil, we labor, we have endurance, but we grow weary of doing good in the sense that we lost our first love. We're just old soldiers going back into war with no passion for the country anymore. There's all kinds of things that can happen. But it begins with us asking ourselves, how personally faithful am I? And how am I interacting with the congregation around me? Am I uplifting those who are weak? Am I encouraging those who are faint-hearted? Am I correcting those who are in error, in love and in patience? What am I doing for the work here? Whether or not we grow, or we shrink, or we stay the same numerically, our faithfulness has nothing to do with those things. It has all to do with what we do in our relationship with God and our relationship with others. Song has been picked out number 815. Dennis will lead us back in a few moments. Sometimes we have a tendency to shift responsibility a lot to the congregation we're part of. But our personal faithfulness is always our personal faithfulness. And Revelation chapter 2 and chapter 3 makes that extremely clear. Whether they're in a bad neighborhood in Pergamum, they can remain faithful. Whether they're in Thyatira and there are those who are actively seeking to physically seduce people around them, they can remain faithful. And they can't blame that on somebody else. They have to take that for their own responsibility. Same thing with Sardis. Even though they have a reputation of being alive, but yet they're dead, there are some who still remain faithful. And that goes for us. I can't blame you guys for my lack of faithfulness. And I can't give you credit either. And the same goes vice versa. I'm going to be responsible for me. I have to give an answer for all that I do. And each week we take a few minutes and just ask you guys to consider that about yourself. How personally faithful have you been recently? Are there areas that you've been struggling with that you would like the prayers of the congregation, would like help with? Because there's That's the whole point of having a congregation and a family to be able to confess to and to work with. But if you walk out and you don't let anybody know, there's a whole lot less we can do. But if we can help you to do something, please let us know as we stand in sing number 850.
Bring Christ your